Good afternoon. My name is Rowena Arshad. I'm the head of school here in Moray House, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's lecture. So the plan is that Gloria will speak for about 50 minutes, 45 to 50 minutes, and then she has very kindly said that she will do some questions and answers, or discussions actually, because we're an audience of people who are interested in issues, so we may actually not want a Q&A, but we may want to put some points across. So feel free to do that after. Okay, so Gloria has inspired, I think, many of us in this room to challenge our own practice in terms of getting it right for every learner, and particularly learners who are minoritized by the mainstream. Her research in culturally relevant pedagogy has been used by scholars all around the world and as a framework. And for those of you in academia, I looked up Google Scholar, and she has been cited, her work, over 50,000 times. That's quite phenomenal. Yes, I see some jaws dropping in the hall. Gloria was the first black woman to become a tenured professor in University of Wisconsin-Madison School of Education. And when I looked at the date, I actually thought, what? Really? 1995? That's not that far back. That's quite shocking. However, she was the first, and there's always a first, and then hopefully more to follow, and I'm sure more have followed. She became the Kellner Family Distinguished Professor of Urban Education at the Department of Educational Policy Studies at the same university. She was the AERA, the American Education Research Association president from 2005 to 2006, and is currently president of the National Academy of Education in the United States. I think it'd be fair to say that Gloria really was the person that brought critical race theory applications to education. And of course, most of us will have read one or more of her critically acclaimed books: The Dream Keepers, Successful Teachers of African American Children, Crossing Over to Canaan, The Journey of New Teachers in Diverse Classrooms, to name just two. As this is my final summer as head of school of education, I wanted someone whose work had inspired me, lifted me, empowered me to be the person that gives this year's annual lecture. Remembering that Gloria loves Scotland, I wrote and asked her to come, and I was delighted when you accepted, as I know that Gloria continues to have a punishing speaking and public engagement schedule. I would encourage you to tweet tonight. There are many people who sent apologies and they could not come, and people often follow Twitter to find out some of the key headlines from the talk. And if you are tweeting and manage to do so, there's the hashtag on that screen, hashtag MHAnnualLecture19. So without further ado, can I ask Professor Ladson-Billings to give the 2019 Moray House School of Education, University of Edinburgh Annual Lecture on the topic of Going Global, Teaching New Century Students in a Diverse and Digital World. Gloria.
Okay, good afternoon. First of all, thank you, Rowena, for that lovely introduction. It's my third visit to Edinburgh. I think one more time I'll be a citizen, right? I do actually really love Scotland. I think it's one of the most beautiful places I've been. So I'm going to be talking about the whole notion of the way in which young people that we are now working with are kind of reshaping the world, how they are thinking differently about some of the things that we have kind of gotten stuck in. But before I do that, I am obligated to have my Bragg Page. I have 4 children, 5 grandchildren, and my grandchildren are the most perfect individuals ever to inhabit the earth. So what you have here is my eldest granddaughter, who, as you can see, is stunningly beautiful. She is 6'4" and currently plays for the Atlanta Dream professional basketball team. And she also plays around the world. So this last year, she's been in China, Korea, Lebanon. So she's special. This is my next granddaughter, who is a volleyball player. She just completed her freshman year at San Francisco State. Monique had played at UCLA. This was at San Francisco State. And this is my youngest granddaughter, who happens to be a twin. And she is the nation's 15, 16-year-old national hammer throw champion. Now, she has a twin brother, and he always asks, "Grandma, where's my picture?" To which I always say, "Martin, what have you done?" So this poor kid is knocking himself out trying to improve his times in the 100-meter hurdle. So encourage him so he can get up on the page. But I do this because I think it is really important for us to learn to brag about our children. I think we spend so much time focused on what kids do wrong that we forget that they live in a complex, highly technological world, and the fact that they get anything done, I think, is amazing. But let me get into my talk for this evening. I just want to point out that for more than 29 years, I've been focused on helping teachers learn from the pedagogical expertise of those teachers who have been successful with African American students. I coined the term culturally relevant pedagogy to describe their work. And I have to remind people that that's a term I came up with so that I could talk to other people. It's not what they call themselves. They don't walk around the school building saying, "Oh, I'm the culturally relevant pedagogue." I used to say they don't have T-shirts that say that. Unfortunately, I went to a conference and people actually had T-shirts. And I was like, oh God, no, not T-shirts. But it's not their language. What they call themselves doing is just teaching. I'm doing my work. But more recently, I've come to see how the culture that invigorates and enlivens today's students, hip hop, is a primary driver in helping maintain culturally relevant pedagogy's viability and its usefulness. So in this lecture, I want to describe how hip hop provides a hope for encouraging students in a culturally relevant way to ensure their academic, their cultural, and their social civic success. You know, the vision of education in Western democracies is as a primary vehicle for economic success. From the time that our students begin school, they receive a message about going to school to get a good job. And while the overall economic indicators do substantiate the notion that high school graduates earn more than high school dropouts, college graduates earn more than high school graduates, the idea that there is a direct connection between schooling and good jobs is not guaranteed. You see, the vicissitudes of the economy, the changing job landscape, offer no guarantee that a diploma or a degree will result in a job. And I have had that experience up close. My youngest son did what he was supposed to do. He graduated from high school, he headed off to college, he graduated from college, and then the dot-com bust occurred, and he was in that industry. So he couldn't get a job in his field. So one of the things we know, schools can't guarantee that. And I make this point to underscore that we have to help our students understand that the reasons that they should seek an education must be larger than seeking a job. It's linked to their own empowerment and their own liberation. I always use the example, even if one is independently wealthy, you still need an education. So the idea that it's just about jobs is one that I wish we would push out from. So more than 30 years ago, I began investigating teachers who were successful with those students in the US system who we often think of as miserable failures. They tend to be African American students. If you see the data, there is clear discrepancy between the performance of African Americans as a group and the performance of white students as a group. And I came to call this work culturally relevant pedagogy. If you've read any of it, you've seen it probably in this particular book, or if you read the scholarly journals, you've seen it in the American Educational Research Journal. It serves as a theoretical construct for explaining the kind of education that is more likely to ensure the success of most students. So even though I kind of used African Americans as the sort of control group, if you will, or tried to normalize them, I really came up with some theoretical work that would work for all kids. It's just so rare that we use African Americans as the standard. They're usually the deviant. But this particular kind of teaching is important, particularly for those students who traditionally have been underserved in our schools. So in your own particular setting, it may be recent immigrant students. It may be students whose first language is other than English. It may be students who are poorer. It may be students who are suffering with some particular disabilities, but the concept of the rubric works for all students. It involves 3 propositions. And if there are math teachers in the room, I'm hoping that is an equilateral triangle, okay? If it's not, blame Microsoft, not me. That's the one they gave me. But it has these 3 propositions: supporting student learning or academic achievement, developing cultural competence, and encouraging sociopolitical consciousness. So I want to briefly discuss what I mean by each of them and how they apply not only to preschool through high school students, but also to those that we want to cultivate as teachers who can implement culturally relevant teaching in the classroom. So, the first proposition appears so obvious that it might seem unnecessary to even talk about it. But I want to make the point that much of what happens in classrooms, especially college and university classrooms, has little to do with what students learn. Instead, the focus is on what teachers cover. So you get teachers who, particularly university teachers, the students will ask the question, and university teachers' response is, it's in the syllabus. Well, okay, but that's not really answering my question. So we have this whole fetish about covering material. So instead of the focus being on what teachers cover, then what happens is that many of my colleagues are proud that a certain number of their students don't pass their courses. They actually associate high failure rates with increased rigor. It's a tough course. I had the experience of being the department chair in the Department of Curriculum Instruction some years ago, and I got a call from a reporter. He wanted to talk to me because my department had the highest grade point average on the campus of the University of Wisconsin. So I was like, oh, goody, this will be a great article. I didn't know that that was a bad thing. He came to see me and, railing about, oh, your courses must not be that difficult because you have this high grade point average. And I'm like, wait a minute. I said, first of all, how many students in my department are freshmen, first year? And, he had all of his data and he went through and he said, well, you don't have any freshmen. I already knew that. The lawyer in me always knows the answer, right? So I said, how many are sophomores, second-year students? He went back through, and I think he found like 3, and I don't know how they got in there, And he says, well, you have a 3. I said, mm-hmm. So I have an entire department of 3rd and 4th year students. Students are about to graduate, and you think they shouldn't have good grades? They're not taking general education courses. They have they're in the field they have chosen to pursue. He said, well, the math department has the lowest grade point average on the campus. I said, because don't nobody want to be in the math department. They're there because the university requires all freshmen and sophomores to take these quant A and quant B courses. They don't want to be they're never going to take another math course. But that notion that if the grades are good, it must not be rigorous is one that we see over and over in our schools. People who have this notion of having these high failure rates really think of their courses as sieves that allow only a small percentage of the students to get through. But the culturally relevant approach sees student learning as the goal for every student. So rather than creating a sieve, culturally relevant teachers create a net designed to catch all the students. The goal is not coverage, it is mastery. One of the tasks of a course that I offer entitled Culturally Relevant Pedagogy is to have my students go observe teaching in some other place other than the School of Education. So I give my education colleagues a pass. I pretend like all of them can teach, right? So I don't want my students to come back and say how horrible they are. But I say you can go somewhere else in the university. So they're encouraged to go to the other professional schools. So they may go to the law school or the business school or School of Medicine or other parts of the university like the College of Letters and Science or the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences. I even encourage them to look at teaching in non-traditional settings, such as a swim class or Tai Chi or yoga. A few years ago, one of my students did her observation of teaching in the medical school's cadaver lab. And what she described was an excellent example of a teacher who was focused on mastery, not coverage. The lab was comprised of students in groups of 8, and 2 of the students from each group had been in the lab earlier and completed it on the renal system. Their task was to teach the renal system to the other 6 students in their group. The medical professor and a mortician were also in the lab, just walking around, observing the groups, moving from group to group. The 2 student teachers were detailed and meticulous about their teaching. They were quizzing the students in their groups throughout and checking to make sure that every student fully understood the renal system. Now, initially, my student who was observing in the theater part of the room was really puzzled about why these students were so dogged and meticulous. She said, they were like, do you understand it? Say it again. I don't think you're getting it. Say it one more time. No. Come back. Let's start again. And she said, why are they like going nuts about making sure every single student understood it? The reason that the students were so careful with their group members was that the medical professor would eventually choose 2 of the students in their group to take the lab exam for the entire group. And the grade that these 2 students received would be average. So it wasn't like, I'll take the highest score. They're going to average those scores, and then it would be given to everybody in the group. The medical school is looking for maximum competence from its soon-to-be doctors, not coverage from its professors. So, as someone who is getting around that age, if I end up with kidney disease, I don't want anybody who got a C on the renal lab. I want to make sure that they were able to understand it fully and got an A. But what might it mean for us to develop teachers who demanded this kind of high-level performance for all their students? The second component of culturally relevant pedagogy is perhaps the most misunderstood: cultural competence. When I use this term, I am referring to one's ability to be firmly grounded in his or her culture of origin and fluent in at least one other culture. For most students of color, this generally means that they develop a deep understanding and an appreciation of their own heritage, history, language, and customs, while also accessing the mainstream culture. White middle-class students are not exempt from developing cultural competence. And although schools typically cater directly to their culture, they too need to become fluent in at least one other culture. In the US, I say it is a crime that our students do not leave high school able to speak Spanish. Just look at our demographics. The Los Angeles Unified School District is a majority Latino district. Most of the kids in the Los Angeles Unified School District have Spanish as their first language. That's not going to change. It will be more intense, and yet we, for whatever reason, don't insist that our kids become bilingual. In an ideal world, all of our students would leave school multiculturally competent, to be able to deal facilely with the cosmopolitan, global world which they'll find themselves. But at minimum, every student should leave school at least biculturally competent. They should have a firm grounding of their own culture and fluency in at least one other. But how can we develop culturally competent students if our teachers are culturally incompetent? The third component of culturally relevant pedagogy, sociopolitical consciousness, is the most ignored. Teachers understand the need to ensure student learning, and indeed some are sympathetic to supporting students' cultural competence. However, the idea of helping students engage directly in the social and civic concerns of their schools, their communities, their localities, the nation, and the world seem beyond the scope of some classroom teachers. In plain language, I think of this component as the so what factor. I used to teach in public schools. I was a secondary history teacher, so I had to face that question all the time. Why we gotta learn this? What does this have to do with anything? And students regularly ask us that question. They want to know why they have to learn particular things, and what we regularly respond with is because you're going to need this one day. Okay, I have a t-shirt that says, another day in which I did not use the Pythagorean theorem. I'm not hating on the math people, but the truth of the matter is we don't help kids understand the connection between what we're teaching them and their everyday lives. We keep talking to them about some future as if they're not living right now. By about 9 or 10 years old, our students realize that we're lying. They're not going to ever need this stuff we're talking about. And those who are savvy, will learn, or should I say memorize, what we teach in order to pass our tests and to pass our courses. But those who are less plugged in to education end up resisting in ways that are detrimental to their own academic well-being. A culturally relevant approach to teaching helps students understand that their learning can and should be connected to the everyday problems of living in a society that is deeply divided along racial, ethnic, linguistic, economic, environmental, social, political, religious, and cultural lines. And they should be learning that education can and should help alleviate those problems and those divisions. That is the whole point that the second U.S. President, Thomas Jefferson, made and had in mind when he talked about the need for an educated citizenry. He never said we should have these education systems so people could get jobs. He said if we're going to form a democracy, then we need citizens who can maintain it. And the only way they'll be able to maintain it is if they're educated. Okay, so here I am, 30 years past my first inquiries on culturally relevant pedagogy, and I'm finding the notion of it, at least my understanding and practice of it, evolving in some new and exciting ways. And those new ways are what I want to focus the remainder of my remarks on. That is, how culturally relevant pedagogy can meet the needs of new century students and their teachers, regardless of the level, that is from preschool through graduate education. So first I have a question for you. How many of you are on Twitter? Oh, this is a good group. Great, okay. Sometimes I get like 8 people in a crowd of 100, right? So if you are, that's, like I said, that's great. But if you're not, you are already behind the curve with new century students. Because we're looking at the most technologically astute, plugged in, globally connected generation the world has ever seen. My daughter is very much a techie, and sometimes things just arrive at our door, and I'm like, where'd you get this from? She says, oh, my friend in China. What friend in China? Somebody she's connected with globally, right? But however globally connected and technologically sophisticated the world is, it is not unusual for me to walk into U.S. schools and see signs throughout admonishing students against the use of cell phones. In fact, a few years ago, I walked into a school in Indianapolis, Indiana, and I saw signs on the doors of the classrooms that said, no cell phones, no cell phones, no cell phones. And I really wanted to scream, top of my lungs, it's not a cell phone, it's a computer. That little flip phone you got with the factory ring, okay, that's a cell phone. But if you actually look at young people's use of these devices, they don't make that many calls. You know, we call it. Yeah, did you turn off the stove? Did you know? I'll be late, you know. But kids are doing all kinds of things with these devices. And it's interesting because I think we often hear adults lament that these children, these young people today are so different. But I would argue, no, they really aren't. And I take a cue from a United States basketball coach from the University of South Carolina, Frank Martin. I love this quote from Frank. He says, you know what makes me sick to my stomach? When I hear grown people say that kids have changed. Kids haven't changed. Kids don't know anything about anything. We've changed as adults. We demand less of kids. We expect less of kids. We make their lives easier instead of preparing them for what life is truly about. We're the ones who have changed. What has changed are the experiences that our young people come into school with. And this totally different understanding of the devices that, you know, I'm not using it to make calls, I'm using it, I'm a text, I'm looking up information, I'm connecting with folks, is an example of how new century students' experiences are different from their counterparts in earlier generations. And I'm really tickled at how really stupid adults are about technology. I go to a lot of school districts, and I was in a school district, the Dallas Independent School District in Dallas, Texas. And I wanted to show a particular video, and at that time I didn't embed them. Now I know that I have to embed them. I was going to go to YouTube to show this video, and they have YouTube blocked in the entire system. So while I was trying to figure out what to do, a 14-year-old who was in the library where I was doing this professional development said, "You trying to get to the YouTube?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "You got a cell phone? You got a smartphone?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Give it to me." He said, "Now you can go on YouTube." So I just turned to the adults. I said, "Why are you blocking it? You're not smarter than them around this." You know, but it's this sense of that we think we can control everything they do. So each year, Beloit College, which is a private liberal arts college in Wisconsin, there are 2 professors there that conduct what they call the mindset list. And they do it for their incoming classes. They pretty much tell the rest of the country, these are the freshmen that you are about to admit to your colleges or universities. This is what their life has been like. This is what their experiences have been. So I want to share a couple of these things. I usually come up with about 75 of them. I'm going to share about 10 of them for the class of 2016 when they came in, and they will graduate next spring. So one of the things is that they've always lived in cyberspace, addicted to a new generation of electronic narcotics. They got to have it. They got to have the latest, the newest, the slickest. They've never lived in a world that didn't have these things. For them, Michael Jackson's family, not the Kennedys, are American royalty. And I would say probably on the class coming in is going to be the Kardashians. All right? If they miss the Daily Show, they can catch their news on YouTube. They don't have to, they don't understand this film at 11. That used to be a big thing, the news folks would tease you with something that happened, accident on the A1, film at 11. No, they can find it right now. They can get it. For them, Bill Clinton is a senior statesman of whose presidency they have little knowledge. Or as they said to me, who's that white-haired dude up there with Hillary? I'm like, oh gosh, really? This one I find interesting. They've never seen an airplane ticket. Think about it. Like, I got my ticket. No, sweetie, you got a boarding pass. The ticket, if you see all those numbers running across it, there's a ticket somewhere out there, but you don't see it. For them, women have always piloted warplanes and space shuttles, so they don't understand why we make a big fuss over these things. And in the U.S., we went crazy over Sally Ride. Oh my God, she's going to be in the space shuttle. It's just everyday experiences for them. For them, Star Wars has always been just a film, not a defense strategy. Ronald Reagan told us that was our defense strategy. Attack people from outer space. They have come into political consciousness during a time of increasing doubt about America's future. I find that one really interesting because I'm a child of the 60s, and even though we had all kinds of racial unrest, we were still hopeful. Kept saying things are going to get better. And America was a place where you were going to do better than your parents. That is not the case today. When it costs close to $1 million to buy a home, a starter home in San Francisco, you worry about your future in ways that my generation did not. For them, the Twilight Zone includes vampires, not Rod Serling. For me, Twilight Zone was a show that came on Friday night with Rod Serling where weird stuff happened. And they watch television everywhere but on television. We talk about these devices, right? Now, what I've shared with you are just 10 of the 75 items on the mindset list. And I shared them to underscore how rapidly new technologies have widened the generation gap. Aging baby boomers who have always considered themselves hip and cool and with it are struggling to connect with Generation Y students who will then teach what I term new century students. And while I haven't conducted a scientific study of new century students, I have made what I think are some testable observations about them as learners. And I think we have to consider these tendencies as we evaluate our teaching. So one of the things that I notice about these new century students is that they believe multitasking is an efficient way to work. The cognitive scientists have proven to us it's not. They tell us if you try to do more than one thing at a time, you're not going to do either as well as if you had focused on the one thing. But I walk into my family room and my daughter is sitting there with her laptop open. She has her cell phone, she has her iPod, she got earplugs in. I can see she's texting, she's going through websites, there's a video over in the corner here, and her music is on, and I ask, "What are you doing?" And the response is, "I'm writing a paper." They think that that's the way to do it. And so one of the things we know that they are used to all of this sort of multiple stimulation. They see themselves more as consumers than students. And as such, they are either purchasing an education or shopping for schools. And that's something that we promoted because we're all fighting over these students. We want them to be in our schools. When my daughter was preparing to go to college, she's a very high achiever. She did well on the SATs, which is the sort of college admissions exams. And so all of these schools are writing her. And at that time, they would send what they call view books. So there are these beautiful brochures. It's like you're going to the south of France, right? These incredible four-color brochures about come to our school. And she had so many schools after her that we had to kind of get a filing system together so we wouldn't lose them and keep them in order. And so the system was they would come in, they'd be on our kitchen island, she'd look through it, she'd give it to me, and then I'd file it away. Well, one came in from the University of Colorado, and it just sat there. So I asked her one day, I said, "Jessica, are you ever going to look at this view book?" And she said, "Those people are just selling mountains. They're not interested in education." And when you look at it, it's just red tile roofs and the Rocky Mountains. Not one computer, not one microscope, just these mountains. And so I have some wonderful colleagues in Colorado. So I teased a friend of mine who was the dean of the School of Education. I said, "Lori, you know, Jessica said you guys are not serious about education. You're just selling mountains." She said, "That's what we're doing." She said, "We're competing with California, so we have to tell them that you can have sunshine and snow here. You know, you can ski, you can go to the class and go skiing." So this whole notion has prompted in our students this sense of they're shopping. They're not students, they're consumers. They receive their news, as I said earlier, and their information through these push notices from their favorite internet sites, blogs and programs like The Daily Show. And what I find really interesting is that although they're heavily invested in social justice, they are less sanguine about social welfare, particularly if they have to pay the costs. So that's the part of the healthcare debate in the US, that young people say, no, everybody should have health care. I just shouldn't have to pay for those old people getting health care. So I have to explain it to them in ways that they can get it. So I say, honey, it's like the Lion King. It's the circle of life. You have a turn to pay. When you were born, you did not pay your bill in the maternity ward. Somebody paid it for you. So now you have to pay it. But it's also the same tension we have around Social Security, which is our pension fund. They think everybody should have it. They just don't think their money should be taken to fund it. They should be able to invest their money privately. And a lot of that debate comes up in our presidential elections about where the money should go. I need to tell you that for them, email is an old technology. So you want to know why they don't answer your email? They don't read email. They would prefer to communicate via instant messaging and tweets. For them, library research can best be done on their desktop, which means they rarely leaf through a journal. When I was in graduate school, you found out what the article was, you went to the library, you went into the stacks, you looked for your article, but guess what? You might have seen an article you liked in that journal other than the one you were assigned to read. So you say, oh, I'm going to copy both of these. They don't do that. They click on that PDF that's on the syllabus, they read that article, they're done with it. They also believe that it is important to stay connected. Thus, their phones are always at hand. And in classes that prohibit cell phone use, they're very upset because that's interrupting that connection. And they have very different conceptions of copyright, intellectual property, and plagiarism rules. I didn't think I would have to teach this in college. But because they really exist in a culture that samples from everything, and it is kind of a mashup, they don't understand that it's actually a violation of the rules to just take something from a website and put it in something that they're doing. And I offer these observations not to suggest that we have to adapt to their standards, but rather to suggest that it is important to know where they are so that we can do a better job of understanding them and assisting them, both in the classroom and beyond. So a decade ago, when people referenced the digital divide, they were talking solely about the way social status, class, race, or ethnicity kept some students from accessing electronic information. However, with the advent of smartphones and tablet computing and other mobile devices, electronic communication has become ubiquitous. Even in developing nations, mobile devices provide access to information and global communications in classrooms. I was in a rural school in South Africa, and the teacher was explaining to me, well, we don't have all that fancy technology that you have in the US. And I turned to her students and I said, how many people have mobile devices? Every last one of them. And they were all on Twitter, and they were all on Facebook. So me and the kids are communicating, and the teacher's sort of standing off to the side because she didn't use mobile computing. So when our students can access this information and knowledge through things like iTunes U or open access online classrooms, I think we have to create more imaginative and engaging spaces in our courses, because this is the new digital divide. It's generational as opposed to racial or ethnic or even class-based. Now, the next point that I make will probably be the most controversial thing I say, and that is that I believe that hip-hop can be an important cultural vehicle for connecting what I call new century students. Now, before I lose all my over 40 people, I want to be clear. I am not suggesting that you have to adopt the hip-hop aesthetic. You don't have to sag your jeans or turn your hats around, none of that, all right? But rather, I think the anthropologist in me believes it's important to know as much about a culture with which you work as possible. For instance, when I was teaching Puerto Rican students in North Philadelphia, I began a deep and rigorous study of Puerto Rican culture and the specifics of the 2 Puerto Rican communities that made their way to Philadelphia. Knowing more about those cultures helped me to plan relevant learning activities. It increased my communication with the parents, and it helped to boost student success. It did not make me Puerto Rican. Similarly, when I moved to California, I had to do the same kind of research as I worked with Chicano and Mexican national students. Again, knowing more about Mexican and Mexican-American culture didn't make me Mexican or Mexican-American. It made me better able to serve the needs of the students who sat before me each day. So the teachers that I studied in 1989 did not really incorporate youth culture in their work. And it's probably because they were teaching in elementary or primary grades. And while young children may consume youth culture, it is a student who is in secondary school who is likely to be a producer of that culture. My early dream keepers focused on cultural history that didn't make its way into the official curriculum and textbooks. And some of my teachers attended to the community issues like homelessness or urban renewal or veterans issues. But only one of the teachers in the study actually incorporated rap lyrics in her teaching of poetry. And I've come to realize that today's teachers need to include youth and popular culture in their teaching, and they also need to recognize hip-hop's longevity and its power. We need to take what I would call a cue from Madison Avenue, the U.S. advertising hub, in their ability to stay current with where young people are. So I'm going to show you an ad that actually is not a new ad. It's a pretty old ad, but I want you to see how Madison Avenue incorporated hip-hop way back when this ad was done. So let's see. So if we were really to deconstruct that ad, first you should know that nobody in the U.S. eats Fruity Pebbles anymore. That's old. I mean, I think they sell them and nobody buys them. But you have Fred and Barney from the Flintstones. And Barney is invoking Run DMC. He's wearing the wraparound sunglasses, the pork pie hat, and the gold chain. For the first time ever, the Flintstones, he's got on Adidas. He's got shoes on. They never wore shoes. Fred is scratching. So Madison Avenue figured out there's something in that youth culture that speaks to young people. Now I want to show you a current ad and to let you know that we are still, Madison Avenue is still leveraging the culture.
Hello? Yeah. They say quit, they say done. They say we're too grown for fun. They say old, we say young. We say playful's never done. Don't fight the feeling, just let it flow. Stack it up, rack it up, let it go. After it's calling, pick up the phone. Let's stay playful, Oreo. Everyone's welcome, don't need a label. If we're still smiling, the future's bueno. I got a secret the world should know. Let's stay playful, Oreo. Sorry. Everything you do every day is full. For every moment we're grateful. No matter our glass on the way full. Yeah, stay playful.
So here's Nabisco, the creators of Oreos, using Wiz Khalifa, but not in a countercultural way. He's parenting. He's being a good father. He's moving away from constantly being on his phone to engage with his father, but it is using that whole hip-hop aesthetic to reach its audience. Today's students are what I would call kind of a new breed. I call them new century students. And because of their deep connection to hip-hop, they're something like shapeshifters. They do not fit neatly into the rigid categories of race, class, gender, or national origin that we have relied upon for distinctions and the creation of hierarchy. Their sports heroes, at least in the US, include LeBron James and J.J. Watt, or Serena Williams and Diana Taurasi. You hear black kids saying, J.J. Watt, that boy is bad. They don't say he's white. Or you don't hear white kids saying, oh, I don't want to, LeBron James, I don't like him. They're not caught in those same places that I think we have been. They listen to Drake, Bruno Mars, and Nicki Minaj. I got Justin Bieber up there because Justin just needs help, y'all. What can I say? This is a generation that's more likely to endorse same-sex marriage, and they can separate out the hip-hop traditions, where baby boomers and their parents hear it all as noise. And can I remind you that our parents called rock and roll and rhythm and blues noise? They point out that there's some important definitions and distinctions between hip-hop traditions. So there are all of these traditions. There's not just one hip-hop. I think what happens is we get caught up with this gangster and say it's all that. To me, that's like reading a pornographic novel and deciding you're never going to read another novel. Or seeing an X-rated film and saying, I'm never going to the movies again. It's a genre, but most of us are not patient enough to realize that there's all kinds. What the young people understand is that there are important differences between Lil Wayne and Immortal Technique, or Lil Kim and Anna Tijoux. They know that this culture that they've created is a mashup with permeable boundaries. They're simultaneously sacred and profane, with deep religious convictions and an embrace of all things secular. You have MCs like Lupe Fiasco and Omar Offendum that do not hide their Muslim faith. These young people work in local, national, and global contexts with music and film about Trayvon Martin and Arab Spring. We have hip-hop filmmakers like Eli Jacob Fantozzi, who makes hip-hop films like Inventos, Hip-Hop Cubanos, or Homegrown, Hip Life in Ghana. Eli has actually just finished another film in Brazil, and he's done one in Tanzania. He alone has taken over 3,000 pounds of supplies to Puerto Rico. So he didn't go to Puerto Rico and throw people paper towels. He went there to help and also to present, really promote the culture. The young people that we are serving are not slackers who don't care about education. In fact, they want to be deeply engaged in learning. But they don't want to receive a passive education where rote memorization and regurgitation passes for learning. They want to innovate and create and implement. They are, as hip-hop science educator Chris Emden calls, Chris Emden of Teachers College, trying to get it, that's Chris right there. They're science-minded. And as science-minded individuals, they want to do science rather than read about it. You have scholars like Jeff Duncan Andrade from San Francisco State, and Patrick Camignon from the University of San Francisco, and Ernest Morrell from Notre Dame, who are engaged with youth in important ways. I have scholars like Dawn Alyssa Fisher from San Francisco State, Maisha Wynn from the University of California at Davis, and Elaine Bridgerson, AKA Dr. E, and Dr. E is her stage name, so she's actually a performer. So she teaches literacy at Ohio State, but on the weekends she's out doing gigs. But these are folks that found ways to connect with the community. You have folks like Temple University professor Mark Lamont Hill, who now has a Facebook and YouTube program called Black Coffee, where he talks about various issues. Last week, Mark's guest was Cory Booker, who was one of the hundreds of people running for president of the United States. And he pointed out, he really pushed Cory on his stance regarding whether or not incarcerated people should have a right to vote. H. Samuel Leem, who was a linguist at UCLA and does global linguistics and hip hop in a global context, and Sam Seidel, who works at a place called the High School of the Recording Arts, where students who were previously headed for failure have gained a second chance to put their knowledge and skill in popular culture and the arts to work for both fun and profit. And that high school is actually underwritten by LeBron James. So we have these interesting crossovers from the world of entertainment and sports into the world of education. Some years ago, I had the pleasure of having dinner with MC Lyte, who was arguably one of the most significant voices in hip-hop education and women in hip-hop. And that dinner took place at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where Lyte had come to announce a partnership with our innovative First Wave program, which is the only spoken word scholarship program at a major university. Our First Wavers have appeared on Broadway. They attended the Cultural Olympics in London in 2012. They were in Denver performing at the American Sociological Association conference. And one of our First Wave students was named the Glamour magazine top 10 collegiate woman. One of our graduates, Dinez Smith, became the youngest winner of the National Book Award for Poetry. I'm going to show you just a clip of Dinez's work. It's a TED Talk that he did. I won't show the whole thing, but you can find it on YouTube. So.
Everybody, please welcome to the stage, Dinez Smith. How y'all doing? I hear really awkward ninth grade classes at 7 a.m. on Monday mornings. I'm more excited than that. We are educators. We can sound excited for education. How are we doing? My name is Dinez Smith. I'm a poet. I'm an educator. I'm a human being. A black man. I've come to you today to talk about student voice. I'm going to try to lead this talk today through my own pedagogy. I don't have data, so I don't have data yet. But I have stories for you, and that's what I ask my students. I have my story, I have myself, and I have the ability to reflect. Start with myself. Who am I? I am a mama's boy. I am a St. Paul native. I am very, very black in a political sense, in a racial sense. I am an educator. I am a queer man. I am hopelessly romantic and very stubborn to go on dates, and that is who I bring into the classroom every day, maybe not today. And all those voices fight to speak, and luckily I've lived a life where I've been able to speak to all those voices and all those identities with me, my world. To hear those voices coming from all my students. I want to backtrack, talk a little bit about where I come from and what's surrounding my world. In third grade, I could not read at all. Spelled my name wrong. I could barely tell you what it was. I didn't understand letters. I didn't know how to put things together. And it wasn't necessarily that I wasn't smart. I knew I was. I was bored. School was boring. I didn't want to read about princesses and magical frogs or look at these storybooks that looked nothing like the family or my family or the places that I came from. Wasn't what I was interested in either. I tried to read things like Goosebumps because that was supposed to be cool in the 90s, but I didn't like those. I didn't connect to any of these things, and finally, the former Miss Minnesota winner, Delta Dodo, my third grade teacher, asked me a question that I've never been asked before. What is it that you want to read? And it wasn't about what was available for a classroom or the free books that some reading specialists had laid out in front of me about worked with me throughout that year. And by the end of that year, I was not being able to read at all, reading at fifth grade level. All of it was her actually being questioned.
Okay.
Flash forward to 19.
So I just wanted to stop there because the rest of the talk talks about every juncture in his education where he was able to move ahead is because someone asked him what he was interested in. He came in the first wave. He said, I don't know what I wanted to study at the University of Wisconsin, but this program said, what are you interested in? And as I said, he's just become the youngest award, National Poetry Award winner, book award for poetry in the history of that award. I want to share you an example of one of our other graduates who was an award winner, who recently completed his master's in fine arts.
He's out of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I want y'all to give it up for Jonathan Williams, y'all.
Jonathan Williams, absent. See, I always had the mental capacity and the master key to overcome any academic tragedy, but I had to see. I learned from my faults, because my rotten GPA were where my lessons were taught. I was a 3.6 high achiever up in middle school. No guidance resided in my silence, and swimming pools didn't appreciate the doggy pattern that I had mastered. When Jonathan Williams was absent. Alexander Hamilton High, Milwaukee Public Schools finest. I learned the art of skipping classes and wrote Bueller on my eyelids. Detention room sidekick with some fly kicks and a tight clip. Balled up homework in the same fist these students fight with. Jonathan Williams, absent. It was tragic. Amidst good times and laughing, my GPA was dragging against the system, not mentally in misery. My freshman year stats, 102 days absent. All F's, 0.0 GPA, human to me. Swimming pool, doggy pattern. Drowning. I started a movement for improvement, but couldn't dry off with the white towels my teachers threw in. I tried to show my mind could grow like every other student, but people pass on your perspective when your presence also truant. More than a reflection of a freshman year screw up, but a blueprint of a ladder, with no tools for me to move up. No electricity, mom and pop's missing, so have them drop out. That's just family tradition. Jonathan Williams, absent. I found a flashlight by the name of Uncle Jeff. Moved in. The floor and 3 pillows were enough for me to stay focused, make sure this hopeless ship stays floating. By my senior year, I was actually a senior. Hey, you know, dressed a little cleaner, professional demeanor. It seems to be I'm on track like Jackie Joyner with 6 medals, fighting my academic debt and my fifth medal. But the worst thing you can see when you made it and educated are the people who gave up and the obstacles you evaded. So I mean, we quicker to give up than you do. I mean, we just like YouTube, we just broadcast ourselves and hope that you like it. Maybe care to comment, because I didn't need to be hooked on vines, I just needed people around me to be critical and honest, because we don't know yet that resources and allocated money is the hood's morphine. The only scholarships I knew was professional sports teams. Now I'm here. I'm at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Scholar and resident, full tuition scholarship and Kappa Alpha Psi president. So I'm saying we can be useless, clueless, ruthless, just a nuisance, worthless, just the worst urban person, but we gotta reconstruct our approach to avoid these different labels and synonyms and help the youth overcome this system that's not meant for them. Thank you.
I should tell you that that particular piece was something that Jonathan handed in as an assignment to me for a class. So that's another thing that we see that these teachers do. They don't expect everybody just to do the same thing in the same way. And while most people wrote essays, typical expository essays, he wrote that piece, and that piece won him a national award. He incorporated ideas from our class in it. And so that's what we're seeing with these young people. Last night, because I was a little jet laggy, I was up at weird hours, and I watched a program on TV that featured a Scottish rapper by the name of B. Asha Singh, who uses hip-hop to help rape and sexual assault survivors like herself. Fascinating, fascinating work. So what I'm saying to you is that we have this marvelous opportunity to engage with the most exciting generation of young students the world has ever seen. Their passion and desire merge with new and exciting technologies, and they want teachers who will demand more from them than just Googling some information and cutting and pasting it into a document. They want to think, they want to do, they want to create, they want to inspire, and they want to innovate. They want to learn to think critically and analytically, and they want to be serious about their education, but because for them, hip-hop is indeed their greatest hope. Thank you.
I want to say thank you so much. I originally come from South Africa, been working at a university there in teacher ed, in English language and literacies, and then moved up to Scotland. So a lot of the work that you've done is work that I've worked across both contexts. And so I'm finding a lot of it really interesting, kind of moving from South Africa, where racial politics are increasing and the tensions are rising currently, especially at higher education institutions, and then kind of moving into a Scottish context where issues around coloniality, Scots identity, language and dialect and variation, so kind of all of those things are kind of picking up. And so I guess the question that I'm building up to is related to those adverts that you showed us, and navigating multiple cultures, both by students, both that are marginalized and dominant. How do you navigate? How do you tell the difference between an example of cultural appropriation versus culture as hybridity, or culture that's the mixing of cultures and sharing of cultural practices that's more productive in that way?
So I would have no trouble using, particularly the first advertisement, the Flintstone ones, to talk to students about cultural appropriation. To say, what are they taking from a part of what your experience is, but not actually giving attribution for it. So to have that kind of critical eye at looking at it. I think the second one is using an actual person, Wiz Khalifa, with his son, and so I think they're doing two different things. My point is that they actually, what happens is hip-hop becomes much more mainstream in the world of advertising than it is, say, in school. Interesting that you should say that you're here that you moved here from South Africa. I was just with a colleague from South Africa last week in Santa Monica who does work in hip-hop in South Africa, and Sammy Aleem does a lot of work also there, where a group of young people they've created something called Afro-Cops. So instead of Afrikaans, it is this new sort of linguistic turn that they've made with Afrikaans and more hip-hop language. And so what I think is exciting is the way in which geopolitical boundaries are not limiting the young people. They continue to limit us. We see the world in these very stark and distinct places. But I don't think there's any place in the world that will be exempt from engaging this work. I spent a lot of time in Sweden, and what I've seen in terms of the change in Sweden because of its immigration laws, which are fairly liberal. I think there are probably more immigrants from Iran and Iraq to Sweden than any place else in Europe. And now you're starting to see the tensions. So where Sweden was over this bastion of liberality, what's starting to push up against them is this perception that, oh, these people are coming here taking our resources. So I think we have to engage beyond these boundaries, and we have to ask what constitutes a cultural appropriation, what constitutes really creation of new culture through arts, through the music. One of the things that struck me a year ago when Black Panther hit is it became a kind of cultural event for Black people in the U.S. You haven't seen anything till you see Black people go see Black Panther, because we got dressed up like we was going to Wakanda, right? So it became this sort of moment of affirmation for us, but at the same time, I was struck by how few teachers took it up as something that, I mean, almost every kid had seen it. I was working with teachers in what we call the so-called STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. I call it STEAM because I add an A, because I think you have to have the arts in there. And when you saw how much science and technology, engineering, art, and mathematics is in that film, but we leave it outside of the classroom. So the kids' experiences are, when we want people to take from the culture, they seem not to want to do it. I asked the question of some chemistry teachers, if vibranium was an actual element, where would it fit on the periodic chart? I said, if your kids can answer that question, they understand the periodic chart. If the only thing you're doing is making them memorize the chart, they're not understanding it, they're just memorizing. But if they understand that, well, we got to figure out whether it's a liquid or a gas or a solid, whether it's a metal, whether it's a heavy metal, whether it's a soft metal, how many protons, neutrons, electrons. Now I actually understand the whole concept of this chart you want me to memorize. And I want to know because it's vibranium, and after all, it's from Wakanda. I mean, literally, this merging of culture with the things that we want kids to learn is really what I think culturally relevant pedagogy is trying to get at. And what I'm doing is I'm trying to expand culture beyond sort of just history or established culture, and to look at popular and youth cultures.
Thanks very much, Professor. I find this fascinating because I'm very interested in superheroes and their impact as well in the classroom. I don't think we're mining this well enough. So I also know of students here that I've spoken to before who had correspondence with Tupac in Scotland and who wrote to him and got responses. So I mean, this is a massive sort of underground area, if you like. And I suppose my question is, and I'm going to just play devil's advocate, if you don't mind. It's about the sort of imposition of American culture, which is coming from the whole, media thing, and also about subversion, and when subversion becomes mainstream, and then it loses its cool. That's not happening, obviously, at the moment. But do you see that as a possible danger? And what would you say to the? It's not an accusation, but you see my point about the imposition of American culture worldwide in this.
So why I'm heartened about this movement is, first of all, I've seen hip hop. There's been no place in the world that I haven't encountered hip hop. This morning I took a picture. I was walking down the Royal Mile and I saw that you had some artists coming down. Took a picture of that. Yesterday you saw me take a picture of the graph piece on the wall. People are making it their own. So when I was in South Africa, I saw a program on TV about Senegalese hip hop and how the people of Senegal were using a traditional dance in their incorporation of hip hop and saying, no, it's not that stuff they're doing in the States. It uses that, but it includes this. So I think the way in which people are flexibly grasping onto hip hop as a way to think about their own cultural circumstance. The young woman I watched last night is committed to both her Muslim and her Scottish identity. Almost nothing about her, what she was presenting was, quote, American, I would say. So I think they're not as limited as, again, by the geopolitical boundaries as we are, that they are seeing what is of use and of service in their own context. The hip hop Cubanos, it's always in Spanish. It's not English. It's like we're telling our, and I mean, there's debate about where hip hop originates. I think if you actually go back and read a book like Jeff Chang's Can't Stop, Won't Stop, we have to point to Jamaica. And in fact, the first real breakout hip hop artists, Africa Bambaataa and DJ Kool Herc, both have Caribbean ancestry. So what's beautiful about this is hard to just pinpoint it. Now, yes, America is notorious for commercialization and exportation and exploitation. We're good at packaging stuff. You know, we can get it out there. But I don't think that it has the same level of impact once you get into these local communities and see what people are doing on their own with these art forms.
Yesterday I tweeted something which my colleague and friend Alison Fitz, who is from the University of Glasgow, tweeted, and she said something like, if you're over 40, it's not her that said it, it's just something she picked up and tweeted. If you're over 40, you should start looking for a mentor under the age of 13. So you're the mentee, they are the mentor. And I actually think there's something there we need to hold, that is something quite real. And way back in the early 80s, and I don't know who she is, but her name is Charlotte Epstein. She's a teacher. It was in a book about teaching controversial issues. It was as far back as 1986. And the quote at the top for Charlotte was, "We can educate tomorrow's generation if we free ourselves from our own prejudices and, I guess, boundaries."
Yes.